They're disagreeable kids. They're tough as boots, you know, and they'll basically stand up to you. And they're not that easy to scare, especially if they're low in neuroticism. And so with them, it's like, why the hell should I listen to you? And, you know, my son was like that, and he was like that when he was 9 months old. Like, he'd stare me down. It's like, it's so impressive. It's like, you're this big, and you're really soft. It's like, what makes you think you're so tough? So anyways, you know, with the kids that are like that, if you don't socialize them by the time they're 4, then they can't make friends, because they don't know how to play and share and all those things, and then they end up outcasts, and, you know, puberty hits and the testosterone rises, and poof, they're in jail. So, you know, and whatever, you've got to be enculturated. And that's the incorporation of the Great Father. And some of that's the superego from the Freudian perspective, and some of that's positive because you bloody well better know how to share and play games, and some of it's negative because one of the things that's so weird about having little kids is that, you know what you give them hell mostly for? Is having fun. It's horrible, you know, because you think you're always punishing kids, if you do, for breaking rules and so on. So no, that isn't what you do. It's like they're running around screaming at the top of their lungs. They're completely having a blast, you know, and they're destroying the house in the process, but they're really having fun, and, you know, it's like, you guys settle down right now. It's like, you're doing that all the time. So not only do you bring the negative emotion, you know, the tears and the pain and the frustration and the anger and the hostility under control, so they stop having temper tantrums and they don't hit you when they're mad or themselves. You've got to get that all under control. Jesus, you regulate the positive emotion, you just dampen it right down until they can go sit with their 80-year-old grandmother quietly, you know. So it's a real restricting process, and that's why half of the Great Father is a tyrant. There's no way out of that. You know, like, you hope that the whole damn thing isn't a tyrant, because obviously by socializing your children, you're doing them a great favor, right? First of all, they learn how to talk. That's fairly useful. They learn how to read. They learn how to play with other kids. So at the same time that you're constraining the hell out of them and making them less than they were in some ways, you're also opening up vistas to them that they would otherwise not have access to. You know, and one of the things that's very much worth thinking about is that you basically die into your personality. You know, so what happens, it's a Darwinian issue fundamentally. When you're first born, your neurons have more connections than you can shake a stick at, like more than they'll ever have in your entire life. And then all the ones you don't use die. And so what that is, it's a collapse of potential into actuality. But let's make no mistake about it, it's costly, because you become what you are instead of all the things that you could have been. And people experience that as a cost. That's the story of Peter Pan. I don't want to grow up, because I don't want to become one thing instead of the many things I could be. Now the problem with that theory is you get old, right? So you don't sustain your potential without, even if you don't develop it, it doesn't just sit around. It goes stale and curdles and gets sour, and so it's not an acceptable choice, but people make that choice all the time, especially if they think the Great Father isn't anything but Captain Hook, right? A terrible pirate tyrant who's terrified of death. Crocodile, right, with the clock in his stomach. It's already got a piece of him, and that's the Dragon of Chaos. And he's being chased by the Dragon of Chaos. I mean, like, if you're terrified of the Dragon of Chaos and you're in the patriarchal role, you're going to be a tyrant. And then why the hell would anyone grow up to want to be like you? One of the things I see in my clients very, very often, and this is more characteristic of the males than the females, is that many of them will not allow themselves to experience anger or aggression or to express it because they had tyrannical fathers. You know, and so one of the things they decided when they were like 4 was, I'm never going to be like that. It's like, well, that doesn't work out because, you know, you need the capacity for anger and hostility and aggression and all that. You have to have that at hand. And you don't fix it by refusing to manifest it. All that does is cripple you, because you're missing half of your emotional dynamism and a whole chunk of your power. You know, you don't have that many sources of power. You've got enthusiasm, that's a good one. Curiosity, interest, appreciation for beauty, you know. Anger is unbelievably useful. It's a tremendous reservoir of power, you know, and you don't want to suppress that. You want to harness it so it's at hand, so that people don't mess with you. Because they will, you know. People will push, especially pushy people. And if you can't, well, if you can't push back, they're going to walk all over you. They won't even notice, you know, because you'll just move. And they won't even notice that they pushed you over. So when you'll go home, you'll be all resentful and irritated and brood on it for a month, and it's like, they didn't even notice anything happened. So, you know, so the men I've seen often will refuse themselves access to anger in particular. And then with women, it's often the case that they have a harder time getting access to it because women are more agreeable than men. You know? So it's harder for women often to be, you know, it's hard for a woman, even if she's pretty damn tough, to really contend with a guy who's really tough. It's difficult because guys who are really disagreeable, especially if they're physically intimidating and super smart, man, those people are very, very difficult to deal with. You know, because they'll cut you into pieces verbally and they won't budge. And so you have to really ratchet up your preparation before you can withstand that. And you know, a lot of women here who are going to be in corporate environments and dealing with people who are tough, you know, you got to get prepared for that, and it's no joke. You know, there's some very, very, very rock hard people out there, and that's a good thing because nothing would happen without them. But you know, they're a force to contend with. So, anyways, the dragon of chaos, roughly speaking, differentiates itself into these fundamental, you could say, personified elements. But personified is the wrong idea because, you know, usually when you think of something as being personified, you think of it as being something, and then you act as if it's taken on personified qualities. You know, so it's like a projection. Now, I don't think that's how it works. I think that we naturally experience the world in the personified categories. And then we have to take them apart to get the world, you know, to get the differentiated world out of them. So, for example, when you're a baby, roughly speaking, the world is your mother. And then as you differentiate the world, it starts to turn into things that aren't your mother. But it isn't like you confuse the world with your mother to begin with. It's the mother is the world to begin with. And it's a perfectly reasonable way of thinking about it. I mean, you're only this big. Your mother's really big. And she's taken 3 billion years to build. So, you know, that's a force of nature to contend with. And by conceptualizing that entity as the world, you've done a pretty good job of initial modeling. Because think about this. You're actually a reflection of the world. Right? You really are, because you were shaped by the world in your evolutionary development. It's like, here's the world, here's you. You're a little reflection of the world. Because the world has made you, and so you embody it. The world is the sort of place where something like you can adjust to it. That means you're a lot like the world. And so if you start out with the assumption that the world is a lot like your mother, it's like, that's a pretty good assumption. It is pretty much like your mother. And she is a force of nature. And so it's not personification. It's first pass understanding. And then, you know, the father comes into it in one form or another, you know, in a fractured form perhaps, or a complete form. You know, you hope that you have a parent, you hope you have an archetypal parent in some sense, who embodies the entire dynamic range of what it means to have that gender, because then they're a really good representative of the world. Also, most of the world that you're going to interact with isn't stuff, it's people. So, insofar as your mother and your father are the world, that's a really good model, because everyone you meet is going to be your mother or your father, roughly speaking. So, you know, if they're very dynamic people, and they embody the full range of human possibility, you know, insofar as one person can do that, then they're excellent models for what you're going to be interacting with for the rest of your life. And that is what they should be, right? Because on average, what you should do for your children is be as much like the world as you can be, because that'll prepare them for the world. So you shouldn't be too nice, because the world isn't too nice. And you shouldn't be too harsh, because then you'll just crush them. But you shouldn't be, like, making things easy for them. You know, you should be making things as difficult for them as they can possibly manage. And it takes you really have to have a relationship with the child to be able to do that, because you've got to keep them in the zone of proximal development. And to do that, you have to know what they're like. You know, and so if they can carry 5 pounds Monday, you put another ounce on Tuesday, and you know, that way you allow. It's the anti-Oedipal approach. You encourage them to become strong and independent. very hard on parents to do that, especially if they define their lives by their children. You know, because they won't want the child to leave. That's not a good thing. Because you don't end up with the child, you end up with a crippled monster. And, you know, in the closet, you know, not good. So, okay, so anyways, you know, and the child obviously is there too. There's the mother, the father, and the child. That's the archetypal situation. That's the world. And so that's what things break into first. And I think our social cognitive primate brain operates that way. And then if it operates that way, and there seems to be plenty of evidence that it does, then the next thing you might think is, well, maybe that is the way things are. Since our brain evolved and mirrors reality, that's a perfectly reasonable way of thinking about reality.